Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. And I'm really excited to introduce the author and podcaster and overall great person to interview, Stephen Dubner.
Hi, Evan. Nice to be with you all.
I'm a huge fan of your podcast of Freakonomics, Super Freakonomics. What's the next one going to be called? You have to outdo Super Freakonomics.
We used to have a list of names, and then we started doing. Now I do podcasting and radio instead. So
Yeah.
books are like I can barely remember what a book is. I still read them, but yeah, I don't write them anymore.
Well, I was very glad to see that you have transcripts of your podcast too. So that you could probably just release that as a book.
The dirty secret is, even though radio and podcasting seem like to the world of consumers like a very different medium than book writing, for me, it's very similar. Like every episode of Freakonomics Radio is kind of like a book chapter. We have an idea,
Right.
we do a bunch of research, we try to find a bunch of data, we try to dig underneath what people think they know, and then tell a story. It's just in audio form, but the writing is actually very similar, and it's kind of my favorite part of doing podcasting and radio is the writing, because writing is alchemy. It's more, the whole is more than the sum of the parts. And in this world where we get so much information, I mean, if you just think about how much information we all produce and consume every day, there's still a huge premium on, high value information that's considered and that includes research and reporting and a good piece of writing. So, in a way, I'm shocked that podcasting has become this huge industry. On the other hand, it makes sense. People like stories, people like learning stuff, people like having a community and so on. So I lucked into it, but I'm going to pretend that I did it on purpose.
Well, the quantity of information you're getting across the world seems to be higher. I mean, you're on your 400 something podcast. I mean, that's an enormous amount of information. Do you think if you'd been writing books during that time that you would have generated that much information?
No, I mean, look, I came up as a journalist. My dad was a journalist. It was really, my first love, and I've done a lot of other things along the way. But one thing I always liked about journalism is that it forced deadlines on you. So when I was younger, like as a student, I was the worst procrastinator. I was really bad. I know a lot of younger people are. People generally tend to get better with that as they get older. But with doing a weekly show, it forces a pace of research and thinking and writing that when you're doing a book, I mean, you get a book deal, they give you a bunch of money. They say, when do you think you want to turn this in? You'll say, what year is it now? 2020, about 2024. You said it way in advance. And man, there is a thing called Parkinson's law, which says that you expand you use up all the time you're given. I sometimes think of it as like the carp rule. If you get a carp and put it in a little bowl, it'll be this big. And if you put it in a big one, it'll grow. And so I think deadlines are, for most humans, some of us are so driven and disciplined and goal-oriented that they don't need it. I'm not one of them.
Yeah, well, actually, one of the things we're going to talk about was the planning fallacy, and that's very related, right? Is that when people plan, I see this in my work too. You set a certain amount of time to do something. One problem is that you talked about is people tend to be overly optimistic. On the other hand, if you try to be pessimistic, then people kind of fill the time and you don't get things done as quickly as possible. Can you talk a little bit about sort of, your lessons from the planning fallacy? Because I know we have a lot of people in the audience that plan projects and know maybe they won't turn out as badly as the Second Avenue subway, but
right.
They know that there's a lot of pitfalls in trying to plan projects.
Yeah, so exactly right. And I like the way you framed it, because it really is about costs and benefits. I mean, the most useful element I think of working for me with an economist and with a bunch of economists and using the tools of economic analysis, or that is one of the major tools is cost benefit analysis. And a lot of businesses do it, not all do it as much as they should. Very few individuals do it, and they don't really apply it holistically or as often as they could. But you just have to tell yourself, for every benefit, there is a cost. So if you want to push people hard, you're going to suffer quality. If you want, so I think if you think about every project in terms of that, you can do a little bit better. But as you mentioned, the planning fallacy is omnipresent. So I live in New York City, where the rule of thumb for, let's say, construction, home renovation projects, the rule of thumb is it's going to take twice as long and cost twice as much. Even though everybody knows that, no one plans for it, no one budgets for it. So what the planning fallacy means is it's a combination of a few things. It means we're not very good at predicting the future generally, which is true. It means a lot of us are not very good at math or measurement, which is unfortunate. On the other side, the benefit, if those are the costs, is that we do also suffer from, as you said, optimism bias. Now, I consider that to be a really great trait of humankind. Like, you wouldn't want everybody to be fully pragmatic or pessimistic, because then you wouldn't have the dreamers, the reaching beyond the goal. You want people to be optimistic. But I'll tell you, like, Danny Kahneman, who's one of my really heroes, and I'm sure a lot of people know about him and have read him. He's a psychologist who won a Nobel Prize in economics many years ago. And he did a lot of work with his late colleague Amos Tversky about basically decision making. And I knew that this was interesting and important material when years ago I was writing about Danny. And he, one thing that makes him so beloved in the field is that he's deeply humane. And he also points to where he has the flaws that he identifies. And he said, even though he'd written about the planning fallacy, even though he'd written about all these cognitive biases that we're now generally aware of, he succumbs to every single one of them.
Yeah.
Every single one. So when
It takes
he's
one to know one.
I guess so. But what's amazing is that even when you know the bias, it shows how the human condition is so strong that it's hard to overcome it. Like, one of his things wasn't about the planning bias. It was about marginal costs. Like it's the idea that if I say to you, Evan, would you spend $10,000 on this chair? And you'd say, $10,000 seems a lot for a chair. Okay. But then let's say you're going to buy a house and the house costs $2 million, but you can get it furnished for just another 100,000, which means that chair would have cost maybe
Right.
10. You're like, what's
Yeah.
zero? Fine. Just throw it in.
Context.
So all kinds of, so in terms of what you can do about the planning fallacy, if you want your projects to not be as disastrously late, there's been some good research. It goes back, as you said, to data. Try to find the best data you can from projects that were similar to the one you're attempting. Try to see exactly, how long it took and what it cost. But there are a couple other kind of organizational things that I think are really useful. One is, I don't know if you've heard the term pre-mortem, but this is a practice where if you're planning a project, this isn't so much about the timing of the project, but the ultimate success. You bring together everybody in the group and you say, okay, let's imagine that we launch this project, whatever it is, today. And now cast your mind forward to, let's say, 2 years from now, and it was an abysmal failure.
Right.
Now that you have that eventuality in your mind, why do you think it failed? And this is the pre-mortem. And you find that if you do this exercise, people are very good at identifying the problems that they're a little reluctant to identify right now because of the optimism bias. Another tool that's really useful is to use what are called prediction markets, which are basically like betting markets. They don't have to be for money. They can be for prizes or pride or whatever. Although honestly, the best prediction markets for a firm to use are anonymous, because you don't. So for instance, if you're starting again a big international project and you're the boss of that, and you say, I've got this timetable that I think is legit and I want it to happen here. Well, what you want to do is you want to gather information from the rest of your team. But again, they might be a little bit scared of telling you, you are nuts for thinking that 18 months is legitimate. It's going to take way longer for this reason, this reason, this reason. Additionally, the people that you think, the VPs that you've got on this project that you think really know what they're doing, they actually don't. So if you set up an internal prediction market where people can essentially wager the equivalent of money, you find that those predictions turn out to be much, much, much better when anonymized than if just like the C-suite people get together and say, here's what we're going to do.
Right. Well, no one wants to be viewed as a naysayer, even though they might know things that you don't know. That's definitely a problem, is that hidden information. I do notice on the flip side, with really successful entrepreneurs that I've encountered, they are relentless optimists. And I think they view that as almost part of their responsibility, is to, manage the art of the possible. And to them, looking back on past projects, well, no, this one is totally different. We're so much smarter. We're going to do it better. And they often confuse the tenses. I hear like my mentor, Larry Ellison, often, and this is this is great, is he says things already exist that don't actually exist, but in his mind, they exist already. So
Wow.
that's, that's a different,
Look, who am I compared to Larry Ellison? I
well,
would believe him. No, I mean,
no,
see,
it's not correct when he says that it exists.
yeah, but I think there's a lot to be said for that. And we were talking a little bit before the call, Evan, you and I, about how data and data science are incredibly powerful, but they are a tool in the toolkit. And there are other tools that are incredibly valuable, like optimism, like intuition, like drive and grit. And so, there's, with everything that there's a science to, there's an art to it too. So, I'm a big believer in, it's very easy to say, well, look, let's look at the aggregate data and see what on average works. And that is useful. But the fact is true also that if you look through history, a lot of history was created by the total outliers and the anomalous.
Right.
Einstein, we haven't had an Einstein since Einstein. And before Einstein, we didn't have a Newton since Newton.
Wow.
And so there's a lot to be said for the people or the groups or the ideas that are radically, radically different. That said, I think about it a little bit like golf. Like everything is risk and reward. You're on the 18th hole,
Right.
and you need to win this hole, and it's a long par 5, and you think, if I hit the best drive of my life and I hit it 300 yards, then I'm probably going to win this match. What are the odds of doing that? They're not, maybe like 6%, but you know what? 6 out of 100, if the stakes are enough,
right,
you'll go for it. And so like a Larry Ellison, an Einstein, and Newton, the outliers are worth paying attention to. It's just that you also need to recognize if you yourself have those abilities and skills, and if you're in a mode where that anomalous behavior is worth it. And often it's not.
Right. And so I think you're right that you have to sort of blend the optimism and the desire to change the world and be different with realism based on, and it's kind of a blended approach. That's great. So one of the first questions I was going to ask was about, it's related, about meetings, because projects have lots of meetings, right? But of course, everybody complains about them. They say the reason we're going to be late on this project is because we're having too many meetings. And, you had a great podcast about them, which, what you'd come out of that podcast thinking meetings basically suck. So, so maybe to help people avoid some of those pitfalls, what were some of the learnings from that about how to make great meetings? And I'm already trying to follow some of them, but I'd love to hear them from you.
All right. So first of all, when I say that meetings mostly suck, which we did, to be fair, I'm not a person who enjoys meetings. I mean, I became a writer in part because I don't enjoy it. So if you're someone who runs a lot of meetings or participates in a lot of meetings, keep in mind that I've got a bias like everybody does, and I'm a little bit anti-meeting in my bias. That said, there's a lot of research about how everyone feels about meetings.
Right.
And the fact is that most people agree with me that meetings tend to suck. On the other hand, if you take away all of our meetings, we get really unhappy. In other words, we like the social interaction. We like looking forward to it. We like looking forward to the opportunity to impress a superior. We like looking forward to, if you're a superior, getting to, kind of check in with your team. So there is a lot of benefit, again, against the cost. That said, most meetings aren't very good because they don't have a solid and original agenda. A lot of meeting agendas are vague and recycled. A lot of meetings have, the worst, say the meeting scholars, the people who study this, is like the regular Monday afternoon check-in meeting. Like that's the worst, because again, getting back to Parkinson's law, that's a space of time. We have to fill it up. We can fill it up with gold or we can fill it up with garbage. And you'll often find a lot of garbage. So, when you're writing this specific agenda, not only is it enough to have an agenda, but I think this is the best advice, which is don't bring people together unless you have specific questions to answer or problems to solve. If you just want to check in about how people are working, there are easier, quicker ways to do that. Most of them electronic, but you can do it in person. I think the thing that people don't think about is that there is a real upside to getting together in person, and that's the thing that you should take advantage of in a meeting. And what's good about getting together is you get instant feedback. You get a real sense of how people receive an idea. You get a real sense of who's reluctant to propose an idea in a public setting. So here's an anomaly, I think. Meeting culture in our country and most other cultures is dominated. The speakers who dominate are the people who tend to be kind of noisy and confident, which, by the way, is heavily correlated with males, okay? Not exclusively, but heavily. So just ask yourself this, what's the probability that people who are noisy and overconfident are also the people who are good at coming up with the best ideas? I would argue there's probably a negative correlation, because how do you come up with good ideas? Quiet thinking time, quiet conversations, taking walks, whatever. So what happens is that meetings, which are supposed to produce these good ideas, often exclude the people who are most likely to have the good ideas, which are the quieter people. Maybe they're introvert. So anything you can do, whether it's, an in-person meeting, one simple trick is to make sure you go around the table, beginning, middle, and whatever, and say, so-and-so, I haven't heard from you yet. I'm curious what your thoughts are on this. You have to invite people, because the in-person dynamics are really debilitating. I will say this, also, meetings are usually scheduled for too long. Most meetings don't need to be an hour. If you call a lot of 12-minute meetings and 14-minute meetings, the oddity will stand out to people and the specificity will appeal to them and they'll be better. But the bad news is, during COVID and during all this working from home, meetings are up about 13%. And additionally, the average quality of the meetings have gone down. So think about that. We're getting more and they're getting worse. So, there are new problems. Some people have a hard time managing the communication flow with the software, whatever. There's also this a tendency now known as social loafing, which is I'm on, so I'm showing up, so you can see that I'm there, but I know I don't have to participate. So again, what can you do to address that? One of the nicest pieces of advice I got from, again, a meeting scholar is, even when you're doing virtual meetings, try silence, which is to say, maybe it's opening up a shared doc to input your ideas, but let everybody adjust that way rather than have it be just a talkathon, because the talkathons just don't accomplish much. And the single best thing to do is end on time, so that people feel that their time is really respected. So don't take away the meetings, because people want them, but they can be way better. Sorry, one last thing. Good friction of the right sort is really useful. There's nothing worse, I think, especially if you're the person running the meeting, to let it be known that I'm going to I'm going to check in with everybody, but really we're here to listen to me tell you the way it's going to be. And once you set up that dynamic, you're just killing all the incentive for people to contribute real ideas. But the best meetings are those where there is a good constructive friction. And I think there's a lot of ways to do that really directly. I think people are way too polite, so yeah, that's a really good idea, but no, it's not. You think it's a really good idea, but you could say, I disagree, and here's why. So there's a lot of ways to be, the way that we're all hard on ourselves when we're coming up with ideas. So I think we should be that aggressive with other people. But I'll never forget, here's the reason I don't like meetings. I used to work at the New York Times, and I was the youngest person at this. I had just been hired. I was at the New York Times Sunday Magazine, and I was so excited and proud to be there. And but I wasn't all that confident in myself yet. And we had a disaster, which is our cover story for the next week, fell through. I don't remember why. And then, usually those stories are weeks or months in development, but we had to come up with something that could be turned around fast. And the boss said, okay, all hands on deck. Let's get in the meeting room. Let's go. And he said that thing that we've all heard before, which is there's no such thing as a stupid idea. We just have to get everything on the table. And I'd had this idea kicking around, but I'd been afraid to float it. And I thought, well, man, here's my chance. He said, there's no such thing. So I raised my hand. I said, I pitched my idea. And he literally said, okay, I'm going to amend that. There is such a thing as a stupid idea. And that was it. So when you do that
ruined you for meetings forever.
For the next year or two, I kind of kept my head down. Yeah.
Well, one of the things I've noticed is there is a nice feature in Zoom where it's a chat. And I've seen that people that are ordinarily quiet in meetings will type something in the chat that's you really would have wanted them to say. So maybe there's some ways we can use that kind of approach to get some of the quieter people to talk. The other thing I've noticed is, and this I took from your podcast, is encouraging people to send out the meeting information before the meeting. And what is really great is if basically everybody's read it, and then you can basically start by saying, okay, what are some of the issues people saw? Rather than going through every single slide and then hope that at slide number 27, someone speaks up about it. So that makes it way more efficient.
Totally agree. And, on the rare occasions when I've had a meeting where people are all on the same page and it's not page one, like people, Amazon, for instance, is famous for the long memo that they'll read during the session. I'll just give you a quick example. We're building out our little Freakonomics radio network. We're trying to pilot and start a bunch of new shows. And we have this one show with these 3 hosts. They made a pilot without us. And then we came in and kind of critiqued it in a shared doc. And, I've got so little faith in people now that even though I spent several hours putting comments in that document with very specific and general feedback, and we sent it to them, excuse me, a day or two ahead, because you can't send someone the notes 15 minutes ahead. That's just stupid and unfair. So we sent it way ahead, but I was still assuming they're not really gonna, get way into it and absorb it. But they did, all 3 of them did. And so when we got on this meeting, I was prepared for it to be a long meeting where we'd have to kind of restate all the positions. And instead, one of the guys said very brusquely, which I didn't mind at all. He said, hey, we read the notes. We get it. If we disagree, we'll let you know. But let's assume that we've taken your notes and are on to the next step. And I thought that's the success. But unfortunately, I feel that's rare. And I think that's the manager's fault. If you want people to absorb and be ready to respond, you have to give them good material, give them in plenty of time, and let it be known that this meeting is not about discussing the issue generally. It's about, let's solve this problem.
Right. Absolutely. Well, speaking of sort of, the change of things and Zoom meetings and the like, we're 6 or 8, 7, depending on how you count it, months into this pandemic. Right towards the beginning of the pandemic, you had a podcast about social distancing and what might be the effects. And it was kind of quaint to read it now in some cases, because it had things like, well, if in a couple months, things are back to semi-normal. But a lot of it was, a lot of the things that we're still thinking about and are really coming, people are seeing sort of the light at the end of the tunnel. And there was a lot in there about remote work and how is, what's going to be the new normal of remote work. And I think people that are looking to maybe next year sometime, some people coming back to the offices, who's going to come back, how much space do we really need, are starting to think about that. And there were some interesting insights that you already had from studies that had been done before. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that and whether anything that you've seen in the subsequent 6 months has provided any more clarity to how things are going to
Sure.
end up.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, we talked about working from home. We talked about a few other kind of early consequences or unintended consequences, including like pollution, which was
right.
There was a remarkable study that was done very early in China that looked at, air pollution, maybe in late February or March. So China, obviously the The virus was there early. They shut down almost everything early. Air pollution was down so much that even though 5,000 people, I think at that time, had died in China from COVID-19, which now seems like a very, very, very small number, it was estimated that 50,000 people, there would have been 50,000 fewer deaths as a result of the lessened air pollution because of that. So that's an example where I think a lot of us, policymakers, technologists, companies, are going to be looking again at costs and benefits. So like, wow, if we can make, if we can decrease transportation by that much, what are the costs? Well, a lot of people really miss being able to fly around the country and do their work and their pleasure. On the other hand, think about the public health benefit of that. So it's not like it's got to be all or nothing, but again, it might be a way to inspire a way of thinking about polluting less while getting the benefits of that. The working from home stuff that you mentioned, yeah. So we spoke with an economist at Stanford named Nick Bloom, who's a very clever guy. He's done a lot of really, really, really good, what you'd call kind of field experimental research. He's asked questions like, does management consulting actually work? Does good management actually matter? Short answer to both of those is yes, but it's harder to measure than you'd think. You have to do these kind of randomized trials. So what he did is in China, he did a randomized trial, or he attached himself to a company that was doing it. There's a company called C-Trip, which is, I've come to understand it, is essentially the Expedia of China. And I think they were looking maybe to save money on office lease, or I'm not sure why they did it, but they did an experiment where they had roughly half their employees start to work at home. And the good news is, for the sake of science, is they randomized them. In other words, you don't ask who wants to work at home, because those are going to be the people who, whatever, it's going to be a self-selecting population. So they randomized. And basically what Nick Bloom and his colleagues found was that overall, working from home produced more happiness and higher productivity, but it was not for everyone. So there were some people who adjusted really well and some who did much less well. And then life is complicated. There are all kinds of factors. Did I do better working at home because my home is maybe quieter than my office, right? Open office situations can be really noisy. Some people, if you don't have kids or pets around, it can be really quiet at home. But if you have a bunch of kids at home, as many of us have learned, it totally changes it. So the bottom line is, we are a heterogeneous species. Some of us will do better. Some of us will do worse. The biggest downside for people who did well working from home, and this is a cautionary tale as we all think about coming back from COVID, the biggest downside is that people who worked from home that were more productive and were happier, they got promoted much less often, which makes sense because you're not around the power structure and you're seen as a satellite person. But I think what's really going to be most interesting is, like your firm, you may require that certain people have to be back in the office pretty much full time. And maybe depending on their role, not so much. But let's say that you require that all engineers do need to come back. And let's say that most of your engineers said, man, I was really happy working at home. What do you do then? That's when you need to try to identify through measurement what exactly it was about working at home that made them happier, more productive. Maybe it was the fact that they didn't commute. That's going to be hard to negotiate. But maybe it was just the fact that they had chunks of uninterrupted time. Right. Maybe it was the fact that they had access to something that, they don't have access to at the office. So there's just going to be a lot of data collection. One of my favorite consequences to measure during the pandemic is what happens to sporting events where there's no crowds. Mm-hmm. So in every sport you look at, I find this just to be a really good example, even if you don't care about sports. Sports, I read a really nice quote. Sports are something like the most important of the least important things in life. That
sounds about right.
Right. Because if you care, you really care, but the consequences at the end of the day are not that great. And, personally, I think that football, especially American football, it's the best proxy for war.
Exactly.
Right. Now that said, if you're doing it, it's physically, it's incredibly hard. So, there is risk there. But sports, in every sport, there's a distinct home field advantage. There's never been a sport where the team playing at home didn't do better. And in some sports, it's much higher, but it's always, the home team always wins more than 50% if you average out for their ability. So if you start to ask why, every sports fan knows the answer. It's because athletes know the field or the course better, or it's because they're sleeping in their own beds, or
Right.
they're getting home cooking. There are all these, right? So anyway, all that data was analyzed by a guy named Toby Moskowitz, who's a financial economist now at Yale, but he just happens to love sports. And he and a guy named John Wertheim, who's a very good sports writer, wrote a book called Scorecasting, and they analyzed this, and they found that none of those things could explain the home field advantage. None of them. There was only one thing that could explain it, which was the referee calls.
Yeah.
Now, so then you think, well, wait. And by the way, if you just want to think about like how you figure out that's true, one of the ways they were able to measure that was looking at soccer stadiums in Europe, where so what's the mechanism by which the refs make an extra call or two in favor of the home field? Are they rooting for the home team? Almost certainly not. They're professionals, right? Is it that the crowd is getting excited? Because when you measure whether the crowd inspires athletes to do better, that doesn't seem to be it. But they determined that basically it's that the crowd is so on the side of the home team that the
Right.
referees have an unconscious bias.
Right.
And
the what people are chanting these days is ref US. And
yes,
they
exactly.
probably, at least somewhere deep down, don't like that.
Exactly right. They don't want to be punished, and they don't have bottles thrown at them. So what these scholars did is they measured two different sets of circumstances. Soccer games in Europe, where the stadium was built for multi-purpose, so it had a running track around the field. In other words, where the crowd was sitting far away, so less audience influence, and those where the crowd is right on top of the refs. And there they found that the home field advantage was much greater. Additionally, once in a while, when like some soccer club like AC Milan, when their fans get more racist than they typically are and do something horrible, the consequence will be that they don't allow fans to come back. And the researchers had noticed that in those cases too, the home field advantage disappears. So I have a feeling that one thing we're going to find from this season of the NFL, and we're seeing it a little basketball, obviously it's a little bit different because we're not having actual home field, is that the effect is going to be a lot less. And I think if you look through society at how much change there's going to be because of the adjustments we've made with COVID, they're going to be massive. So it's not just working from home, but it's like, telemedicine.
Mm-hmm.
All of a sudden, telemedicine went from a thing that a few eggheads were promoting, but really it wasn't really being promoted by many other people, especially because the compensation, the reimbursement was very unclear. But because for months we had to have it, regulations changed, insurance companies stepped up and changed it. If that stays the same, that's going to produce a lot of long-term gains. So I don't mean to imply that this terrible, terrible tragedy is just full of silver linings and we should forget about all the death and disruption and economic loss. I don't mean to imply that at all. But the thing I love about our species is we're going to dig into the data and find those silver linings, find those benefits along with the costs. And then whether it's working from home or telemedicine, take advantage of them.
Yeah, that's great. Well, so speaking of hospitals and health, et cetera, there's a chapter from Super Freakonomics, which I think is going to be interesting to some of the people watching today, because it talks about something that they've bought NetSuite for, got implemented NetSuite for, which is centralization of their data. And in Super Freakonomics is a chapter about data revolution in the ER. Where a lot of data, which had been dispersed all over the hospital and all over the medical records, and some not even, electronic, was all brought together. And it was just kind of, the computer was put there that, they said, it said beta on it or something like that.
Yeah.
But of course, everybody used it and loved it. And that, to me, that hit home, because that's sort of what we try to deliver with NetSuite is centralization of the data, one place that you can go to get all the information you need. And but the end of that story is not necessarily as happy as one would like. Can you talk a little bit about that and sort of, the positive lessons learned, but there's also maybe somewhat of a negative lesson
Yeah,
learned?
so I'll start with the bad news at the end, which isn't really it wasn't their fault. And it's not really that bad of news. The bad news was that this system that got built, it was called a Zixi, and the prime mover behind it is a very brilliant doctor and technologist named Craig Fied. And I'll go into the background in a minute, but the end is that it was very successful. As you said, it was very well received within their one hospital. And then it was ultimately bought by Microsoft, and essentially it was forced to compete with another Microsoft product, which I think was called Vault or Health Vault. And they actually just shut down Health Vault last year too. And what's frustrating about this is, the age of centralized electronic medical records, we've been promised this for
Right.
30 years, and for those of us who are not in the hospital, you think, come on, what's so hard about it? And, wouldn't it be great? And so what's so hard about it is that, like any good system, like what you're trying to build, it's hard to build a good system. So the story of Craig Fiat at Washington Hospital Center was he basically realized he ran the emergency department. He realized that there were just all these terrible miscommunications and lack of information. Someone comes into the emergency department. The first thing you want to know is, and this person's unconscious, have we seen this person before? Let's have a way to identify and pull up their complete record. That was not possible. Let's send this person in for some kind of scan. When am I going to get the result? And how long do I have to hold this person here until I get it? What's the likelihood that they're going to be hospitalized, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, on and on and on. Basic information that was not available. And so he said, this is just no way to run an emergency department. So then he went looking for where these different pieces of data were kept within this one hospital. And he found that there were about 100 different silos, which makes sense. Now, this was a while ago too. He probably started this back in the late 80s, early 90s. But he found, for instance, that like sometimes there was payment information or image scans that were housed on one person's hard drive. And if that one person didn't happen to be there that day, the data was inaccessible, just crazy stuff. And so he decided to just take all those silos and treat them like, salt and pepper shakers, shake everything out, go to every single computer, every single system. And he learned to code. And as he described it to me, I know nothing about coding, but he had to learn how to be engaged in object-oriented programming, where wrapping every single thing into its small bundle and making them relate to other bundles. So the good news is it worked, and it started to save lives, and it started to save the hospital lots and lots and lots and lots of dollars. There was skepticism every step of the way. People didn't want to surrender their data. People didn't think it would work, et cetera. But it did prove the value of, as you've implied with your firm, building the system smartly from the outset. But then I have to ask, like, why do they keep failing, these big electronic health records? So, what some people say are the downfalls is that they focus on traditional health records instead of dynamic or patient acquired data, which makes sense. I mean, if you think about it, what you really want to be doing is you want to be integrating the data from the wearables, right?
Right.
So if I come in with a condition and I've got a wearable, that's the
Right.
information that I want to
What's your heart
vacuum up.
rate been? What's your breathing been over the last 3 days? Not just what is it right this very instant.
Exactly. So, I think the moral of the story is, I think there will be a happy ending, but we have to think more like you guys. I mean, look, there's a lot of good software out there that is learned, and especially using AI and ML, that you need to vacuum up everything and learn to disgorge what's not valuable. If you have an inflexible system where you decide ahead of time what's going to be valuable and everything else is excluded, plainly that's not going to be very flexible. So look, I really empathize with the healthcare, anyone in the healthcare system generally. Their technology and their ability is amazing. It's gotten much, much, much better, but our ability to administer that technology and to pay for it conscientiously is really bad. And there's a ton of perverse incentives in there. And I'd like to say that it's getting better, that problem is getting better. We're working on a couple episodes about that right now. But it's hard to be super optimistic, in part because the incentives are often crossed. That's the
Right.
real big issue. I'll give one, since I like the silver linings. The hunt for a COVID vaccine has totally changed the way a lot of medical research will be done in the future,
Hmm.
both in terms of the regulatory environment and in terms of how it's funded. So there have been there's a financial economist at MIT named Andrew Lowe, who had, I think, several people near him either die from or get very sick from cancer. And he went looking into cancer research and how it really works. And what he found is that it works again in silos.
Right.
He thought, what if we could basically have, private or private public funding for cancer research, a fund to spread this money out to accelerate basically what's happened with the search for a COVID vaccine. And, he came to the conclusion that with something like $50 billion, which used to be a lot of money before multi-trillion dollar bailout packages, you could essentially, solve many of the most, common cancers and other diseases. So I think, again, we continue to learn these lessons, but some of these problems are so hard. And then there are discoordination problems additionally. That, I think, is the worst, is where you have a big institution with 10 smart people who aren't talking the same language to each other.
Right. Well, and speaking of, I listened to that episode about vaccines, and it was fascinating. And it's coming to ahead right now in terms of like one of them or many of them are going to be approved. And when you read about it, even the experts have disagreement, and it's the same thing with testing. What is the right thing? Because there's always trade-offs, as you say, and I think a lot of it really can benefit from a sort of economic type thinking analysis. You have some people saying the tests have to be really accurate, because otherwise you're going to have people that are going to be released into the and think that they're okay and they're not. Other people say it's not as important that they be accurate, they be cheap and fast, so everybody's taking them. And I think that sometimes people that read these articles throw their hands in the air. Well, if the experts can't agree, I mean, how are we supposed to figure out what to do? But obviously this is actually a natural part of the process. But how do you look at that sort of thing when there's such disagreement? And this with vaccines, is 50% the right? Should we, how should we decide whether a vaccine is quote unquote good or not?
Yeah, gosh, there's so much good there to unpack. I mean, one big downside of the political social environment that we're in right now is that we've forgotten how to disagree. And we've forgotten that it's perfectly legit and kosher to have people with totally differing, not just opinions, but perspectives on even a set of data. And the key is really to make sure that you can hear strength there, area where, look, I don't think academia is at all perfect.
Mhm.
But this is one area where I do wish that policymaking and government were a little bit more like academia, in that you can go to, a seminar. I mean, honestly, the most brutal conversations I've ever heard have been in econ paper seminars at the University of
Right.
Chicago. And I sit
Well,
in
they
there,
say that why are academic arguments so vicious? It's
the
because the
stakes
stakes
are
are
so
so low.
low. Yeah, that's exact. Although they don't seem low when you're there
Yeah,
in the room.
right. And when you're talking
But
about COVID.
yeah, exactly. I'll tell you. All right. So this is a very tangential example to come around to some of the points you're asking about, but it's one of my favorite examples. So I happen to be Jewish, and in Jewish uh, scholarship and thinking, there are what are known as two ancient schools of wisdom. When we talk about like the ancient sages, there's Hillel and Shammai. And so if you read like the Jewish, the Talmud and so on, there's often like Hillel says, do this, do that. And Hillel was, he was a big thinker, a good guy, da, da, da. He was really good at slogans. So like, do unto others as you like to have done to you, was basically essentially Hillel. So he was really good at reducing complicated things to small things. But here's what's cool. If you read like the Talmud, even though Hillel's argument went through the legal process and all the vetting, all the counter arguments of Shammai are still preserved within the Talmud. And the reason is you want to show that A, the opposition was pretty smart also, but you want to show why the winning argument won.
Right.
And sometimes it's hard to call, and sometimes it was very close. And I feel that that actually is a really good model for thinking about, I understand why you say that this kind of testing is optimal or this kind of contact tracing is optimal, but let me offer an alternative and say that I, I can see why that makes sense, but cost-wise and time-wise, I don't think we can afford that right now. And we don't have that kind of conversation
Yeah.
anymore. Now,
I
I'll
think
tell
people,
you,
yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think people, when they see an argument now, they assume it must be right versus left.
Exactly. So I'll give you an example of where I've seen this play out, what I think is pretty successfully within the COVID arena, which is within the NFL. So we did a piece about the NFL and COVID testing. And what was so interesting is that you had two essentially equivalent experts on either side of the issue. If you think about it, one is the chief medical officer for the NFL, a guy named Alan Sills, and the other is the chief medical officer for the Players Association, whose name I'm totally blanking on, but is also a great doctor who's really, really good at his job. Now, most people who even like football a little bit, they don't really know, they just see football, the teams, right? But as it turns out, the players are essentially employees of the teams, of the owners, and they're represented by the NFLPA, which is the equivalent of, an iron workers union or a teachers union. And very often there's a huge disagreement between them and the ownership, which is essentially the league. So in this case, they had to come together and decide, how are we going to collaborate to do it? And they had a lot of disagreement. The players essentially wanted to play in a bubble. Like, the players would have been willing to move to someplace
NBA
and
style.
NBA style. Now, it's a lot harder for NFL than NBA. NBA roster is 12 or 13. NFL is 53. You're only playing once a week. It would have lasted 7 months. There are a lot of logistical issues, but they wanted that for protection for themselves and their families. And the owners, the league said that's really not viable. So they were able to work out a series of compromises, but what they really worked out was a protocol with input from both sides. And it turns out that so far, the protocol is working really well. There have been positive tests. There are certainly going to be, but they kind of know what to do. And that was a result of trusting science, being incredibly flexible, that when you start planning in week 1, that whatever happens in week 4, you're going to have a different view of what that is, because you'll have gained a lot more knowledge by then. And additionally, this is where I think this is a big one. Everybody's got personal responsibility. There's this thing called the Peltzman effect, named after an economist, Sam Peltzman, who was a transportation economist. And he made the argument long ago that seat belts, which were introduced in cars a long time ago, but a lot of people didn't want to use them, that they might actually lead to more accident or fatalities and accidents, because people would feel that they were safer than they actually were. Okay. And you see this idea a lot, where if we have a safety measure, we might let up on our behavior a little bit. And I think what the NFL and the NFL Players Association did is decided, if we preach this message that we got it all locked up, like we're going to test everybody every day, which they do. They also used a lot of technology. They had wearables, which were good for not only reporting, but good for contact tracing. So again, I kind of wish we all had what the NFL had. We don't. But rather than give this message that like we are airtight, we're perfect, instead they gave the message that this is an incredible challenge for all of us. And even with the best technology, really what we need is great behavior. And then they did some smart things too. Some of the kind of tricks that you learn from behavioral economists, which is, find everybody's weak spot. And so for a lot of young men in their 20s, if you tell them, listen, you're young and strong, you might get sick and be fine, but what about your grandma? And what about your mother? And what about the whole rest of your family? And so they were able to kind of package science and gut in a way that I think, again, with opposing sides was really fruitful. And I wish that could be a little bit more of an object lesson for all of us, because I hate the fact that as a country, we're facing this tragedy and we're not all rowing in the same way. I'm not a political person at all. I kind of hate politics, but to me, in the beginning, everybody said this is beyond politics. And I thought, great, let's prove it. As it turns out, unfortunately, it's not always the case.
Well, you did bring up seatbelts, and I just want to clarify because it's very clear in Super Freakonomics that seatbelts have in fact saved tons of lives, but it took a long time, and it kind of took, well, it took a cultural change, and it's probably took some laws, and it kind of reminds me of the mask situation. They say that mask usage has gone up considerably lately because of certain events, and maybe hopefully they'll be more effective. But that's a, you know, I think that's a great way of thinking about how we can present data that's sometimes conflicting without making people throw their hands up in the air. I just wanted to finish up with really, you know, what ties together so much of what you do is looking at data, asking the right questions, sometimes being skeptical of data. And there was a podcast that your collaborator did. He took over your seat for one episode, which was about how should we be changing what we teach in schools to be more things about data science and understanding data, and ultimately building data fluency, which I think you would believe would be a good thing in general, but it's not so simple as just giving people a course, or, you know, and so what would you say about sort of the rise of data fluency? Is it increasing? What, you know, what things can be done, and what are some of the pitfalls of this kind of very data focused view of things?
Yeah. So the narrow argument that we were making is that most high school students are required to take forms of math that they'll never apply, right? So whether it's trig or calculus or whatnot. And you
You'll
could
never
say,
use the SAS theorem.
well, you might, I don't know. And
I
some
mean,
people will
I
plainly.
use it to teach my child when he's taking geometry.
Exactly. Now, to be fair, you could say the same thing about, like, what's Madame Flaubert got to teach me? Why do I need to learn about the Peloponnesian War? You know, absolutely. Now, I could make the other side of that argument very easily also, which is it's incredibly useful for the human mind to look at all different kinds of experiences and processes, whether you're going to learn from that directly or not. So maybe you could say the same about trig and calc. But look, costs and benefits, opportunity cost, I think, is one of the most powerful concepts in economics. Every time you spend, 1 hour or $1 or one brain cell on X, you can't spend it on Y. That's just the way it is. So the question is it worth teaching a lot of kind of higher order math, or would we be better off if we educated people just to be more fluent about data generally? Just basic things like probability, like magnitude and things like that. So here's the thing. I'm totally in favor of that, but I worry that it's not as easy as we might think, because higher order math is one problem. Lower order math is its own problem. So as a country, we are incredibly numerate, and that really hurts us. Look, nobody on this call has this problem. But if you want to look at society and you want to try to encourage and get people to do the right thing for themselves and for their families and for society, take one very basic thing, financial literacy. People should be generally a little bit understanding of how money works, how their debt works, saving versus spending and investing and so on. But there is a scholar who studies financial literacy named Anna Maria Lusardi, and she is a really good researcher. And she felt like this is one of those things, like, people can learn to drive a car. Think about that. Driving a car is not so simple. Most people figure it out, and then we license them and they're running around. They do kill a lot of people. There are 35,000 fatalities. It's not costless, but people can learn to drive a car and we license them. But like everybody, like most people don't really know how to balance their checkbook, literally. So she was trying to determine both the ramifications of this financial illiteracy, which is huge, because if you don't manage your money well, it's hard to run the rest of your life that well. And she was also trying to see just how bad people are. So she wrote these 3 questions that she got attached to a national like not a census survey, but a big national survey. Here, I'm going to read you these questions. We'll see how you and the other people on the call will do. All right. Number one, suppose you had $100 in a savings account and the interest rate was 2% per year. Okay. Got that? $100, 2% per year. After 5 years, how much do you think you would have in the account if you left the money in? More than 102? Exactly 102? Or less than 102? Okay. That's question number one. Question number two, imagine the interest rate on your savings account was 1% per year and inflation was 2% per year. After 1 year, would you be able to buy more than, the same as, or less than today? Then there was one more that's slightly different. Third question, do you think that the following statement is true or false? Buying a single company stock usually provides a safer return than a stock mutual fund. True or false? The answer, false. These three questions that are kind of comically easy if you're pretty good with math or money. I think 25% of American adults got all three right. I think around 50% got two of the three right. That's tough. So when Levitt makes the argument that data fluency should be taught instead of higher order math, I think, okay, fine. But you're dealing there with a population of kids who are already going to be doing pretty well if they're taking the higher order math. Okay?
They're probably going to get those questions right, at least the first two.
Exactly. And I agree with Levitt that having more people who are data fluent would be better for society. So I absolutely agree with that. My problem is I think there are numeracy or innumeracy problems to be solved that go way down. And here's the thing. I don't think the answer is to teach everybody to be more financially literate. I think the answer is to have products and legislation that lets people do better and make better decisions and run into fewer risks and run into fewer predatory risks and so on. Because, you know, I'm a big believer in like design and technology usually beat human behavior. We do a lot of behaviors that aren't very good. Hand washing. Doctors in hospitals, even their hand washing rate is about like 60%, not 100%. But you know, if you use technology like an RFID tag in your ID that beeps when you leave a room without washing your hands, boom, right? So I love humans, but we screw up a lot. And whenever we can make a better design, a better software, any kind of better technology to make the behavior foolproof, the more we can be left to do the things that we do well, which are creative things, optimistic things, football, stuff like that.
Well, that's a great way to finish off. And I know everybody should be going to Freakonomics Radio, but what we'd love to hear is you say it. Can you give the promo, because we love to hear your voice that you do, of where people should go to learn more of this kind of thinking?
Yeah, sure. So how does that go? Let's see. Yeah, so you can get Freakonomics Radio on any podcast app. If you want the entire catalog, go to freakonomics.com or the Stitcher app. And I will say, since I know, Evan, that you're a transcript reader, on freakonomics.com, we do publish a complete transcript of every episode along with show notes. So if you hear some expert in something talking about some research, we always list their research papers or their books or whatnot. It's a pretty user-friendly thing, freakonomics.com. Thank you for allowing me the plug. That was very generous of you.
Oh, no worries. And thank you so much for joining us. It's been fascinating and look forward to talking in the future.
My pleasure. Thanks, man.
Thanks.